Hi, are you mentally sane? Do you have a loving family? Do you touch grass from time to time? If so, get out! But for those that are still here and don't have a life, I'm proud to announce that I finally have a Discord. You, my fellow subscriber, can now at me in public for no reason whatsoever, only to tell me that you've manhandled yourself for the 10th time this week despite it still being Monday. Or just watch the history behind Dust Finale 4 as YouTube keeps flagging it for copyright. So come on down before I self-defenestrate myself, as let's be honest, this is a bad idea. If you know me, or have at least seen some of my videos, you'd probably know that I love the Sherman. Maybe a little bit too much. And for those who were unfortunate enough to actually meet me in person, you know that I feel like a schoolgirl whenever I see an M4 Sherman, even if it's the exact same Sherman I've seen 5 times in a row. I'm not joking. How do I know? It's because it's the only M4A3E2 that has a Ford sprocket wheel. But I digress. My point is, I love the Sherman. But loving something can also lead to being biased towards something. So, I'm making this video. 1, because the YouTube algorithm loves it when I post something controversial, and 2, to show you, the viewer, that I'm being completely unbiased when I try to shove a narrative down your throat how the Sherman family of vehicles is the greatest thing since Panda Express. But before we do, I'll first be discussing what other people see as flaws, and why ultimately it's not a flaw, or why what people see as a flaw is just them misunderstanding the vehicle. And then we can move on to the actual flaws. Roll the transition!
Эх, ебать!
Boom, 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 boom. I want you in my room. Let's spend the night together from now until forever.
We've all heard the argument about how the M4 Sherman's 75mm is a potato gun and only suitable for taking out fortifications. However, as we all know, this is false. Yes, the M275, the M3's predecessor, was initially designed to lob high explosive at infantry and fortifications. However, it was also found that the 75 had a great anti-tank capabilities, better than the US 37mm in fact, which was designed as an anti-tank gun from the get-go. This is also one of the primary reasons for why the M3 Lee exists. So when it came to designing the M4, one of the main requirements was it to be able to house the 75mm in a fully rotating turret, as the 75mm was the US's best gun at taking out other tanks. When it first arrived in North Africa with the British, it outperformed the German tanks. Even with the arrival of the Mark IV Specials, the Sherman still outperformed them despite them being outgunned at longer ranges. It's only once you get to France and Germany where the 75mm starts to show its shortcomings, but despite this, Shermans were still winning engagements. Yes, most engagements the Sherman found itself in were mostly against infantry, fortifications, and the occasional minor with a Panzerschreck, with tank-on-tank engagements only accounting for 5% of all engagements, but despite this sounding like a small number, they were still quite prolific. I've said this multiple times on this channel, and I'll say it again. When people like to compare tanks, especially when it's a tank-on-tank comparison, people tend to focus on the wrong thing, those usually being hard factors, or how much pen a certain round has in War Thunder. But what people tend to forget is that anti-tank rounds aren't the only types of ammunition tanks have at their disposal. Some can be intended for anti-fortification / anti-infantry work, and some are meant to be for more utility jobs like smoke rounds. But what if I told you, at least in the Sherman's case, AP rounds aren't the only thing that can knock out other tanks? You see, there were other options the Sherman had at its disposal to use against tanks. Those were chemical rounds, high explosive, and smoke. First, let's talk about the prior. High explosive does more than just make a person evaporate from existence and or peppers their body with fragments. It also does something called concussive damage. Concussive damage, or concussive force, is caused by shockwaves created by an explosion. This shockwave, just like any force in the universe, will damage anyone and anything. The bigger the explosion, the bigger the concussive force. So when you hit armor with a high explosive round, that armor is going to need to absorb that energy from that explosion. That concussive force, if large enough, can or will crack the armor welds, cause spalling, or knock out the crew. Obviously, if a tank is hit with enough smaller explosions, the result stays the same. The 75mm M3, which was mounted on the majority of Shermans, fired the M48 high explosive shell, which, for its size, was incredibly potent. This isn't because the M48 didn't just have a lot of explosive filler, the shell was also well optimized. So when a Sherman would meet, let's say, a Tiger, your average engagement would look like this. But that's not all. Earlier, I mentioned that the 75mm also fired another chemical round, that being the M15 smoke shell, or as I like to call it, the funny round. Now, autistic nerd, you may be asking, what makes what is practically just a temporary piece of soft cover so dangerous to other tanks? Good question, and I'm glad you asked. Typically, smoke shells are made from a chemical compound called zinc chloride, which creates a large thick fog when exposed to the moisture in the air. Zinc chloride is corrosive and does irritate the human lungs, eyes, and skin, but it's not deadly, despite being toxic. During World War II, zinc chloride was predominantly used by Nazi Germany and the Soviets. However, the US, and subsequently the British, used a different chemical compound, that being white phosphorus, which ignites when exposed to oxygen, thus creating a thick white screen. As opposed to zinc chloride, which is only mildly toxic and not deadly, white phosphorus, also known as woolly peat, is highly toxic and extremely deadly, which is why it was considered a war crime to use it in civilian areas since 1993 during the Chemical Weapons Convention.
So much for that, I guess.
The human body, when exposed to white phosphorus, starts to do funny things. Not only, as mentioned before, is white phosphorus highly toxic, but also when ignited, burns at a temperature of up to 1000 degrees Celsius, which is almost as hot as most iron furnaces. Yes, air is a horrible insulator, but even then the air in the smoke cloud would still be around 400 degrees. So, if you were unfortunate enough to be inside a smoke cloud, you'd get third-degree burns all over your body. And if you made the mistake of taking a deep breath, you'll most likely accidentally inhale airborne white phosphorus particles, scarring the inside of your lungs. So, once again, going back to our scenario, let's see how that would look like.
Meinen Lungen brennen!
Meine Augen brennen!
Mein Frankfurt ist rundgefallen!
So yeah, when it comes to firepower, the Sherman isn't necessarily outclassed, even with German big cats on the battlefield. During the later stages of World War II, Shermans that mounted the 75 or 105mm employed high explosive and woolly peat extensively against German big cats, especially after the notorious Panther shock in Normandy. Yes, they wouldn't necessarily destroy the tank, but if the crew is knocked out due to the concussive force caused by high explosive, or the crew has to bail because they don't want to be inside what is essentially a mini Auschwitz, then it's a mission kill, which in some cases can be more beneficial than outright destroying it, as it means you've basically captured an enemy tank in relatively good condition. Now on to the next one.
Drop it.
Ah yes, armor. The thing most TikTok and Instagram users will say the Sherman doesn't have. The point is, when someone says a flaw about the Sherman, your average neckbeard is quick to say that the Sherman has thin armor. And in all fairness, this is true when compared to late war German mediums, i.e. the Panther. But Shermans had one of the most effective frontal armor thicknesses out of any medium when it debuted in 1942, and especially when compared to other mediums that fought in World War II. It's only when you start comparing it to the Panther that the M4's armor starts to seem outclassed. But once again, to be fair, the Panther's armor was quite thick for a medium tank of World War II, so much so that 14-year-olds online started calling it the first MBT. And if you are still one of those people, I implore you to shut the fuck up. It's not. Now, what about the side armor? It's only 38mm thick, which is on the lower side of thickness, with a T-34 beating it out with 45mm and the Panther with 40mm. So even though it's less, it's still not by a lot. Also, people tend to forget that this is a medium tank, not a heavy, and typically, medium tanks have thick frontal armor and incredibly weak side armor. But to sum it up, the Sherman's side armor is not bad. In fact, it's above average when it comes to other medium tanks of World War II. So in this instance, the side isn't necessarily a flaw, and it's a medium tank, not a heavy.
The Sherman was a small tank relative to the Panther, but it went up like a tower. Like it was almost like, please blow me up. And they built this really tall, like, I just want this to be the biggest target I can make it.
Yo, bitch boy, understand the logic behind the decision before being a whiny little cuckface. Yes, the Sherman is tall, especially compared to early war tanks of other nations. and on the surface, it might seem like having a tank that's slightly above average in terms of height might be a disadvantage. But yet again, following the trend of the previous two arguments, things aren't that simple. The US has a history of making extremely tall tanks, which all started with the M2 Light. The M2 Light's main power plant was the R670 Continental Radial Engine, and if you know anything about radial engines, it's that they need a lot of vertical space in order to be mounted in a tank. And so the M2 Light was designed with the engine in mind, resulting in a light tank that was fairly tall. The reason for why the US chose a radial engine over your average inline or diesel engine is due to availability, weight, and power to weight ratio. Aircraft engines, which the R67 is, had excellent power to weight ratio, which meant it worked pretty well as a tank engine. Since radial engines are meant for aviational use, the engine was quite lightweight as well, which the Army did like, and most importantly, the R670 was readily available. This solidified the US to accept the use of radial engines in armored vehicles, resulting in Wright Aeronautical to design the R975 Whirlwind engine. Jesus Christ, that was a mouthful. I'm not going to go into what made the two different, as that's a story for a different video, but the main thing is, the US stuck with radials. Now moving on to the M2 Medium, this tank also had a radial. However, this time it was extremely tall, which has to do more with the US being in the cult of the machine gun rather than the engine, with the M2 having 4 Sponson mounted M1919s turning out to be more of a mobile pillbox rather than an actual medium tank. And when we move on to the M3, its height mostly has to do with the Sponson mounted 75mm. So why is the Sherman so tall? There aren't any machine guns nor cannons mounted in the Sponson. So the only reason for the tank being as tall as it is has to do with the engine, right? Wrong! When designing the M4, there are multiple key reasons for its height. 1. The engine, that's pretty self-explanatory as we've already talked about it. The drive shaft, which had to come in this steep angle in order for it to connect to the transmission. The turret ring, which by design was quite wide and deep in order to allow for better ergonomics. Maintenance and accessibility. A taller tank means a bigger engine bay, which allows for ease of maintenance and general components being further away from each other. And finally, transportability. Now, as I said at the beginning, tall doesn't always mean bad. Now let me explain to you why. Your typical argument for why tall equal bad mostly boils down to, oh, but the enemy can see you through the hedgerows. Okay, but so can you see them. Even if the Sherman was small enough to drive below the hedge line, the anti-tank crew will still see and hear your movements due to the engine noise and exhaust alone. Also, if you got a radio, which you kinda want to have if you want to be a successful tank, then you have antennas sticking out of your tank, revealing you and your platoon's movements. However, if the commander's cupola is above the hedge line, yeah, the enemy can see me, but so can I. I've basically leveled the playing field a bit as I have better situational awareness. Not to mention the Sherman isn't that tall. Yeah, sure, it's a little bit taller than most tanks when it debuted, but comparing it to the German big cats, the Sherman is quite average. In fact, the German Panther and Tiger AFVs are taller. So yeah, being tall isn't necessarily a flaw. By now, you might start to wonder, when do I finally get to the actual flaws of the Sherman? As I'm now 7 pages deep, and the only thing I've said is that the M4 Sherman is... And yet I've practically said nothing wrong about the Sherman despite the title of the video saying otherwise. And the thing is, it's clickbait, motherfucker! Get... They thought it couldn't be done. A video actually criticizing the Sherman. Without any of the rinky-dink variable bullshit. Just for a bit of clarification, not every flaw I mention has to do with every Sherman. As for every flaw, there is a variant that fixes that flaw. So for the sake of this video, I will try to mention the fact that it was fixed in a different or later variant, but if I don't, assume that I already know.
Realizing 2014 is only 3 months away. Yeah.
First, let's talk about the most obvious one, that being flotation. But first, what is flotation? When someone says a tank has great flotation, They don't mean a tank can float on water, but rather they're talking about ground pressure. You see, the entire reason for why tanks have tracks is due to ground pressure. For all you youngsters out there, you know how when you stand on thin ice, the ice starts to crack, but when you lay on it, it doesn't? Well, that's because instead of putting all your weight on 2 points, that being your feet, you disperse your weight across your entire body, thus allowing the ice to not crack. The wider the tracks, the lower the ground pressure, thus allowing the tank to traverse difficult terrain more effectively than a tank with narrow tracks. And if we look at the Sherman, specifically ones with standard VVSS suspension, you'd notice that the tracks are quite narrow. If you're wondering why, the answer is quite simple. 1. Ease of transport, and 2. That's just how most countries did it at the time. Looking at the majority of tanks made prior to 1942, you notice that the tracks are quite narrow, as most tanks at the time evolved from light tanks from the interwar era. It's only with the Soviet T-34s and KVs, and the German Tigers and Panthers in 42 and 43, that we start to see tanks with wider tracks. Hell, even some tanks, including the Sherman, that originally had narrow tracks, eventually came around to get wider ones, via either track extensions or a complete overhaul of the running gear. So even if this problem is eventually fixed, it's still a flaw on most Shermans, especially ones that still have VVSS. This one will be short, but we need to talk about the engine. No, not the sexy V8, which is perfect in every way possible and has no flaws whatsoever. Don't fact check that! But rather the Continental Radial, and radial engines in general. While there are advantages to having a radial engine, mostly revolving around its simplicity and its cooling system, the flaws outweigh the benefits. First of all, the engine had a tendency to overheat during prolonged use. This was due to its cooling system. Most radials are air-cooled, which is ideal when it's used in an aircraft, but not so much if you're conducting an operation in North Africa. Meanwhile, the majority of purpose-built tank engines are water-cooled, as water is a better heat conductor than air. Secondly, the engine was quite underpowered. An underpowered engine? In the Sherman? Impossible, right? Wrong! No. The Continental Radial was not underpowered in the traditional sense, as it had an excellent power-to-weight ratio, but it was underpowered from an operational standpoint, mostly due to poor low-end torque. Low-end torque is the engine's ability to produce power at low RPMs, which is critical when accelerating or driving up a hill without needing to rev the engine too high. Having low-end torque also means you can add extra weight to the tank without losing performance at lower speeds, which is also one of the reasons why the US chose the gas turbine for the M1 Abrams over the Continental diesel, allowing the tank to be more future-proof.
There's nothing that would justify the use of a gas turbine over a diesel with a similar power.
Which leads me to the final flaw with the engine. When over-revved, the engine would have a tendency to burst a cylinder, which, if you know engines, isn't really ideal. The US tried to address this problem by giving the engine a governor in order to regulate how many RPMs the driver can input. However, this wasn't a foolproof solution, as the governor could fail when not properly maintained. Army Ordnance tried to address this problem with different variants for the Continental R975, with other variants like the R975E3, the R975C2, and the R975C4. However, none of them managed to eliminate the problem completely.
Back it up, back it in, let me begin.
Roy, shut the fuck up! For anyone that plays tank games, you know exactly what I mean. The reverse speed of the M4, and most American tanks at that point, was abysmal, and having a good reverse gear could mean life or death if you get into an oh fuck moment. The US tried to address this issue by adjusting the gear ratio, but this made it almost impossible to go uphill. And then tried again by adding a secondary planetary gearbox to the back of the transmission, which did work. However, by that time testing was done and the final paperwork was being finalized for production and approval, the war had ended and Sherman production stopped, resulting in the problem not being fixed in the end. Another flaw of the transmission, if you can really call it a flaw, is that it had a clutch-rack differential steering. Now, what is clutch-rack differential steering? For that, let's first compare it to clutch brake, as that's what most people think the Sherman has. Clutch brake is where you pull a lever, which disengages one sprocket, thus allowing the tank to turn. If you really wanted to turn, you can pull the lever even harder, and that would engage the brake, thus allowing for a tighter turn radius. Pretty simple, right? Well, clutch-rack differential steering works a bit differently. Instead of braking, the differential splits the power between two sprockets. One speeds up, while the other one slows down. This is also called regenerative steering, and is present on almost all steering systems that aren't clutch brake. However, clutch track steering has one distinct difference between other regenerative steering systems, which I will get to. Now, differential steering does have its advantages. 1. It makes the tank easier to drive, thus reducing driver fatigue. 2. It doesn't slow down the tank nearly as much as clutch brake when turning. 3. It doesn't cause as much wear and tear like clutch brake. And 4. Differential steering allows for better off-road performance. Now to the difference. Unlike other regenerative steering types, the clutch track differential steering has a fixed radius, which on the Sherman is about 9 meters. And this turn radius is not speed dependent, so no matter how fast you're going, you will always have a turn radius of 9 meters. Now, before we start talking about the flaws of the M4A3E2, i.e. the Jumbo, we first need to go into the history of why it exists in the first place. In 1942, the US and British tank committees recognized the need for a heavily armored assault tank. This discussion would inevitably result in the creation of the T-14 and A-33 Commodore, which, as we all know, didn't really get further than the testing phase, and the program was eventually dropped. However, by 1943, the US was starting to encounter German tanks with big penis guns much more frequently, which resulted in tankers mounting makeshift armor onto their Shermans. In response, the US Army offered a solution. Rather than designing an entirely new tank from the ground up, the US chose to adapt the already existing Sherman platform by welding a bunch of weights to an M4A3 in order to see if the hull and powertrain could handle the extra weight, which they found out it could. This led to the E2 program, which eventually became the M4A3E2. The M4A3E2 then ran its trials and was accepted for production soon after. However, the US saw the E2 as a temporary solution until the M4X program was finished. This was because the M4A3E2 was far from perfect, which I will just get into right about now. A lot, if not all, the flaws that solely apply to the M4A3E2 revolve around its weight. And in order to stress how much its weight is a problem, I will, for the remainder of this chapter, hold a 15 kilogram weight above my head, because I fucking hate myself, and you know what? I'll try to do it in one take, with no script. So, here we go. First, let's talk about the suspension. Jesus fucking Christ, this is heavy. First, let's talk about the suspension. So, if you really had to guess what the problem with the suspension is on the M4A3E2, it's because it's overstressed, like a lot. And if you look at photos of, if you actually look at photos of an M4A3E2, you notice that the suspension has a slight dip to it, like that the entire hull is like slanted forward. This is because of just how fucking heavy it is. Yeah, it's heavy, and yeah, you can. I think what was it called? I called it, I think, T14, T48 syndrome. I don't know. Yeah, the tank was, the front end was so heavy that the entire hull had a suspension. Now on to logistics. First, fuel consumption. Because the tank was so heavy, fuel consumption was, Jesus Christ, this is fucking heavy. Because fuel consumption was, because the tank was so heavy, the engine had to exert more energy, thus using more fuel, which, you know, pretty much cut the operational range of the M4A3E2 in half. Next is transportability. It was hell getting these tanks onto Liberty and Victory ships because of just how heavy they were. And next, operational readiness. Because of the suspension being overstressed, it means they had to be maintained constantly, which decreased operational readiness. Finally, turret traverse. Sometimes if the hydraulics on the turret traverse would fail, it would be almost hell trying to traverse that turret manually, kind of like on the KV2. Jesus fucking Christ, I need to drop this. Fuck! So yeah, the M4A3E2 has a lot of flaws, and so does the Firefly, which I will talk about in another video comparing the American 76Ws to the British Firefly, but that will have to wait. So instead, let's talk about Ammoracks. This wouldn't be a video talking about the Sherman's flaws if I didn't talk about this one. So, here we go. Yes, the M4 Sherman did have a problem with its ammo racks, most notably in its arrangement inside the crew compartment. For those who don't know, M4 Shermans without wet stowage, also known as dry stowage, have their ammunition stowed in the sponsons. Yes, it does allow the ammunition to be easily accessible, but it also means it's more likely to get hit. Obviously, this isn't exclusive to the Sherman. Obvious candidates are the Tiger AFV, the Panther, and the Panzer IV, for example, but this video is about the Sherman. Now, let's play Kahoot. When the ammo rack of a Sherman is hit, what is most likely to happen? If you said it'll most likely explode, then you'd be wrong! Yeah, War Thunder isn't real. Shocker. But for those who said it'll start a fire, here's a cookie. This doesn't mean explosions never happen. I'm just saying that there is a much higher chance of the ammo rack starting a fire rather than eviscerating the crew in an instant. It's also due to these ammo rack fires that the Sherman obtained a 60 to 80% burn rate when knocked out. Most self-proclaimed historians will spread the myth that the reason for the fires is because of the high-octane fuel. And like most myths, there's usually a 1x1 Lego piece of truth in it. And if I had to guess, it mostly has to do with the Soviets.
Oh, way down south in the land of traitors, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away.
After the Spanish Civil War, where Soviet tanks were first put to the test, the Soviets found out that their tanks, most notably the BT series, were catching fire a little too often. This, unlike the Sherman, however, had to do with the high-octane fuel, as, due to the design of the Christie suspension, the BTs had their fuel tanks placed between the suspension springs, resulting in the fuel being idiotically close to the fighting compartment, whereas the Sherman had its fuel tanks placed away from the crew compartment. This, coupled with the 60 to 80% burn rate, meant the result of this myth.
We'll all go down to Dixie, away, away.
Another myth is the nicknames, Ronson, Zippo, and Tommy Cooker, all of which, except for the last one, are quite easy to debunk. The nickname Ronson is wrong because the slogan giving evidence to why it was used, that being lights every time, is a post-war slogan, with its actual wartime slogan being press, it's lit, release, it's out. The nickname Zippo is tied to the Ronson myth, and is actually one of the newer ones that arose as it started somewhere in the early 2000s. And this one is more of an accident rather than people trying to push a narrative, as it's mostly a misunderstanding. As people were starting to debunk the Ronson myth, one of the arguments against it was the Americans never called them Ronsons as that was a British company. Instead, they would have called them Zippos. Now, this caused an internet-wide game of telephone in the tank enthusiast community, which is how the myth was formed. The final one is a bit trickier, as instead of zooming in to find the problem, you have to zoom out. The term Tommy Cooker, contrary to popular belief, is not a German nickname for the Sherman, but a British one. However, the nickname was not exclusive towards the Sherman. In fact, it was a nickname for all Allied armor the British used in North Africa, including the Crusader, which was famous for not catching fire very often. Now, why is that? Well, it's quite simple actually. It's because of the North African heat. If you've ever seen the video where German tankers are cooking eggs on a tank, that's not because there's a stove underneath that box heating up the plate, that's because of the sun. Now, imagine what it must be inside that tank. It's going to be hot as fuck. And since Tommy was slang for a British person, the nickname for most tanks in the theater was thus Tommy Cooker. Anyways, I digress. I still have to say a few things about the Ammorack, so bear with me here. First, let's look at that 60 to 80% burn rate. Around 60% was recorded by the Americans, and around 80% was recorded by the British. On paper, this seems less than ideal. However, this was quite typical for any other tank of the time, like for example, the Panzer IV. Also, keep in mind that these are all after action reports, meaning after a battle, they would go out and look at their knocked out tanks, and mark it if it could be recovered, or if it was in a state of disrepair, i.e. it burned. Meaning that not every tank written as caught fire actually caught fire when the crew bailed. It's much more likely that the Germans just kept shooting at the damn thing until the thing caught fire. Another flaw was wet stowage. Okay, maybe not a flaw in the traditional sense, but we'll get there. Wet stowage Shermans typically do have a lower burn rate of about 5 to 10%, but it didn't necessarily work as intended. You see, the way wet stowage was theoretically supposed to work was that a shell was hit, the gelatin substance, or whatever it's called, would prevent the round from igniting. In practice, however, it didn't really work. Soviet tests showed that the ammo would still ignite even with wet stowage. The only saving grace for wet stowage, however, was that the ammo was stored in the turret floor, rather than in the sponsons, significantly reducing the likelihood of the ammo getting hit in the process. On earlier Shermans, most Shermans did not come with a loader's hatch. The US tried relieving this problem by supplying crews with quick-fix hatches. However, it was obvious that this solution would only take them so far, and by mid-1943, US factories started producing M4s with loader's hatches.
Oh, nah, I ain't seen nothing. I ain't seen nothing. Matter of fact, I'm blind in my left eye and 43% blind in my right eye. I don't see much of nothing. Matter of fact, I can't even see you, sir.
Once again, going back to early Shermans, the commander's viewport, there was only one, and it could spin. While this did offer a full 360-degree vision, it was also less than ideal, as you always had to move your vision port and shift your body whenever you wanted to see shit. Thankfully, this was fixed by 1. Sticking your head out of the tank, and 2. In 1944, a full 360-degree vision cupola entered standard Sherman production. And here we get to our final segment, the M4A1's cast hull. I know that this one's a fan favorite, and that there's a belief that the cast hull Sherman is superior to a welded hull Sherman, but before I get to that, let's play one more Kahoot game.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
Yeah, both production difficulties and spalling significantly draw the cast hull down. First, let's start with spalling. People love praising the M4A1's cast hull because it has more deflection surfaces than the welded M4s. However, this also came at a cost. Cast hulls have a much higher tendency to produce spalling when hit. Spalling is also the biggest manufacturer of tank-related casualties during World War II. Now, the reason for why cast hulls are more prone to spalling than rolled homogeneous steel mostly has to do with armor consistency and manufacturing defects. With rolled homogeneous steel, the armor plate has a much more even surface, allowing for more precise heat treatment. However, cast hulls are much harder to heat treat, as it restrains control over metallurgical consistency. Despite being cheaper and faster to produce, casting opens up the risk of having air bubbles in the armor, which significantly increases the risk of spall. Now, onto production. The main problem with casting is not every manufacturing company in the US could produce cast hulls. While yes, some companies that didn't have the facilities to produce cast hulls did have the facilities to produce cast turrets, it significantly puts a strain on logistics and the production line of Shermans. So yeah, not everyone could produce cast hull Shermans, and the US already knew this with the M3A1 Lee. So not as big of a manufacturing problem as I make it seem, but it does put a strain on logistics and the manufacturing capability, so yeah, a flaw's a flaw. So yeah, the Sherman isn't perfect, but this doesn't mean it's bad. Far from it, in fact. And a lot of flaws I said don't necessarily impact the vehicle's performance in any major way. Yes, some more than others, but it is what it is. A flaw's a flaw. If you're wondering why I didn't include things like the small hatches on small hatch variants, the hatch bulges on small hatch variants, its periscope gun sight found on initial production M4A1s, or its early style M34 gun mantlet, it's because they weren't necessarily flaws, but rather things to be improved upon. The Sherman is not the best tank of World War II, as it's not the best tank for every nation. For Germany, it's the Panther, while for the Soviets, it's the T-34, despite their glaring flaws that overshadow the Sherman's flaws to such an extent that the problems that the Sherman had almost become invisible. But in my not so humble opinion, the Sherman is better than the T-34 and Panther. So yeah, the Sherman was not the best tank that fought in World War II, but in my opinion, it is the tank that came the closest to that title. If you want to hear me talk about how great the Sherman is, you can watch these two videos at the risk of your own sanity. This won't be the last you hear about the Sherman from me, as this year I have multiple videos planned dedicated to the Sherman. So if you want to see more, I recommend subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss a video. I'd also appreciate it if you liked as well, as it helps these videos punch through the algorithm. I sincerely hope you get to pet a dog today, and adios.
Freight train, going so fast. Freight train, going so fast. I don't know what train he's on. Won't you tell me where he's gone? Don't know where he's heading for, what he's done against the law. Got no future, got no hope, just nothing but the road. Freight train, going so fast. Freight train, going so fast. I don't know what train he's on. Won't you tell me where he's gone? He lost his reason, lost his life. He killed his friend in mortal strife. He must keep moving like the rolling skies, just a wait until he dies. Freight train, going so fast. Freight train, going so fast. I don't know what train he's on. Won't you tell me where he's gone? When he dies, just bury him please, way down the end of Old Chestnut Street. Poplars at his head and feet, and tell them he's gone to sleep. Freight train, going so fast. Freight train, going so fast. I don't know what train he's on. Won't you tell me where he's gone?